So today's book talk is going to be on a book called Slavery by Another Name. The subtitle is The Re-Enslavement of Black Americans from the Civil War to World War II, and it's authored by Douglas A. Blackmon. The book was published in 2008 by Random House. This is the paperback edition from Anchor Books from the same year. Now, the subject of the book is what the author would call the age of neo-slavery from the end of the Civil War to the end of World War II. The vast bulk of the book really covers the period from the end of the Civil War to the very early 1900s. You don't really hear much about the 1920s and 30s, but that's really a minor point. And what this book is about, very briefly, and then I will, of course, discuss some aspects of it, is the condition of Black people in the United States, particularly in the Deep South, after what was described as the end of slavery. Because the author of this book is going to argue, and I think there is no disputing the argument, frankly. I think the evidence is unimpeachable. He's going to argue that slavery did not end at all. In fact, the 1860s, late 1860s, after the end of the Civil War, going into the 1870s, 80s, 90s, 1890s, 1900, the first decade, that was a period when Black people were re-enslaved. They were put back in slavery, although it wasn't called slavery. It was debt peonage, for example. It was servitude. And in fact, Blackmon is going to go so far as to argue, quite correctly in my view, that this form of slavery was, if anything, worse, if one can imagine that, than had been inflicted on Black people in this country, in the United States, for well over 200-300 years. And what prompted this book, among other things, is that, as some of you may be aware, there is a literature on the use of slave labor by the Nazis during World War II and shortly before that period. And what prompted this book in part was an interest on the part of the author, as he says. He was a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, exploring the possibility of asking a story with a provocative question, or the possibility of a story with this provocative question. What would be revealed, page 3, if American corporations were examined through the same sharp lens of historical confrontation as the one then being trained on German corporations that relied on Jewish slave labor during World War II and the Swiss banks that robbed victims of the Holocaust of their fortunes? And as some of you doubtless know, there is a considerable literature, as I pointed out, but here I'm refining the point, a considerable literature in particular on the use of slave labor in German extermination camps, working camps, which were, of course, most of them were also extermination camps. Right? And there's a good deal of work that has been done on Auschwitz. But here, the emphasis really is, of course, on the fate of the Negro, as Black people were then called. Right? And I need to say immediately that Blackmon says that he is going to use the language of that time, including the word nigger, right? The N-word, which one is not supposed to say at all, of course. And he says that I'm going to use this word because we should be aware of not simply of the fact that it is offensive, but the particular manner in which it was used and the ferociousness with which it was used, that needs to be impressed upon our mind to understand the gravity of the problem that he's describing, the utter diminishment, degradation of the black person in the United States. And I think that I would describe the enterprise of this book in a different way, a complementary way, which is, how is it possible that 150 years after the Emancipation Proclamation of 1st January 1863, signed by Abraham Lincoln, which made the slaves in the 10 slave-owning states that had rebelled, right, the secessionist states that made them free, how is it possible that 150 years after that the condition of the black person in this country still is a condition that shocks us, right? When we look at the number of black people who are incarcerated, when we look at the number of black people who live in poverty, the number of black people in this country who are subjected not just to racial profiling and racial discrimination and racial abuse, but in fact, sometimes murder by the state, right? How is this possible after black people were supposedly freed, not simply by the Emancipation Proclamation, but then by what are known as the Civil War amendments, that is, Amendments 13, 14, and 15 to the U.S. Constitution. And it is with these that I want to begin my discussion of this book. Now, these amendments, let's begin with Amendment 13. So I've already mentioned the Emancipation Proclamation, which of course is not an amendment to the Constitution, right? So the three amendments that we're interested in is Amendment 13, 1865, on the abolition of slavery, which simply reads as follows: neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. And Section 2, Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Now notice that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist except as a punishment for crime. So this amendment is not abolishing slavery per se. This is often missed by people who study the Constitution or teach it, particularly, for example, in schools. Because if a piece of legislation in a state said that you have committed such and such crime, and the punishment for that crime, if you are convicted, will be servitude, right? Then in effect it means that slavery has not been abolished, right? Because of course the question we should ask is, why should slavery be considered permissible as a punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted? Why doesn't the amendment simply say that slavery shall be abolished completely in every possible foreseeable condition? Something to that effect, right? And we're going to see how there were going to be legal loopholes that are going to be exploited by a new generation of slave owners. When I say new generation, it was the same people who were slave owners before the Civil War in the South, and after the end of the war continued to be slave owners, except that they were not known as slave owners because officially slavery had been abolished, right? And then we get Amendment 14th, which is 1868 on civil rights. and it says that all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. So therefore, this meant that this now conferred citizenship on African American people, on black people in the United States. No state shall enforce or make any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Now that's very important to notice, because what we're going to find, as Blackmon shows in this book, is that it was actually under the umbrella of the law that black people were re-enslaved. Right? In other words, the slave owners who persisted in their activities in the period after the Civil War, and particularly in the 1870s and after, because for the first few years after the end of the Civil War, it was very difficult for white slave owners to be able to assert their power. You had federal troops, you had troops from the North that were there. Basically, the American South was under what you might call an occupation, right? Right. So what we're really speaking about is the manner in which these people are going to reassert their power, their rights, their entitlements, white people, beginning especially in the 1870s and thereafter, right? Now, we're not going to go over the whole of Amendment 14th because not all of it is important, but what is important is Amendment 15 on black suffrage, that is the right to vote. And I'm going to read out the words and immediately pose the question that will come to the mind of anyone who is familiar with the history of this country. Section 1, quote, the right of citizens of the United States. And notice that a previous amendment, which I've already discussed here, which is Amendment 14, already confers on black people citizenship. So therefore, this Amendment 15 now applies to black people as well. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the U.S. or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. That is, that black people have the right to vote. Now, if they have the right to vote, ask yourself this: why did the United States Congress have to pass in 1964 and 1965 the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act? If you already have a constitutional right to vote, why did the U.S. Congress have to pass this legislation? It had to pass this legislation because the constitutional right was in effect only a right on paper. Many of you will be absolutely stunned to hear that there were parts of the American South, such as Lowndes County, Alabama, which I have visited 4 years ago, where, let's take a random year, 1900, where in 1900 not a single black person in a county that had a huge population of blacks, not a single black person was registered to vote. And that person was not registered to vote because what the states in the South did was they actually imposed new sets of regulations designed to keep black people from voting. So, for example, they may have a literacy test, or they might ask questions such as, can you name for me all the names of all the elected officials who run the schools in this state? Let's imagine there are several hundred. Well, who would know that? And if you didn't know, reject. Your application to register for vote would be rejected. There's a very interesting article that was published in The Atlantic a few years ago, which I was just reading recently. Unfortunately, I forgot to have it with me while I'm giving this talk. Otherwise, I would have quoted from it, which is a review article on a book on Thurgood Marshall. Some of you who are familiar with American history will certainly recognize his name, because Thurgood Marshall was, of course, the first black person appointed to the Supreme Court of the United States. And this is after he had successfully fought a case before the Supreme Court, a very famous case called Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, which is the case that helped to desegregate schooling in the United States. It's one of the most important cases in the history of American jurisprudence. And what this article points out is that when Thurgood Marshall was appointed to the United States Supreme Court, and when a person is appointed by the president, nominated is the correct word, then that nomination must go through the United States Senate, as we know. And in the United States Senate, you had at that point in the 1950s, when Marshall was nominated, you had, of course, a whole cluster of white racists, racist to the core. And they asked such questions of Thurgood Marshall. They might ask an absurd question such as, name me all the senators, or name me give me the names of the 25 justices who sat on this court in the last 50 years. Right? And one of the persons who asked these questions was Strom Thurmond. I think he was a senator from South Carolina, if I remember correctly, infamous racist. And then Senator Ted Kennedy, who was on the committee as well, the Judiciary Committee, because it has to first go to the Judiciary Committee before it goes to the entire Senate, right, for a vote. He asked Thurmond, can you name me all the people that you're asking Thurgood Marshall to name? And of course, Thurmond couldn't. Right? But this is simply by way of illustration that the problems that he's describing, Blackmon, in this book, are problems that would persist all the way even into the 1950s, 60s, and frankly persist down to our time. Right? So we've looked at the background. That is that you have these civil rights amendments, and these amendments were designed to alleviate the distress of black people, to make black people citizens, right, and to give them the right to vote. And I'm suggesting to you that, however obviously necessary these amendments were, they were clearly completely insufficient to address the acute forms of racism, discrimination, leading to, in fact, a new form of slavery to which these people were going to be subjected. And that is the subject matter of this book, right? Much of the book is focused on Alabama, more broadly on the Deep South, but it's focused in particular on Alabama. And the later chapters look, for example, at Birmingham, a city that was really built on the labor of black people who were essentially slaves. That's what he means when he calls the book Slavery by Another Name. All right. So how did it all happen? It all happened because once the Emancipation Proclamation had come into place, and then subsequent to that, in the next several years, as we have seen, these civil rights amendments were passed. White people were determined to restore their privileges. Right? They were not simply determined to restore their own privileges, they were determined to put the black man in his own condition. And we will see very briefly a cast of characters, but in order to understand how white elites thought of black people at this point in time, let me just look at a few of these white elite slave owners and the kind of pronouncements they made in the 1860s, 70s, all the way, as I said, until the early 1900s. All right? So, for example, we have a man called Governor Cole Blease from South Carolina. This gentleman was of the view that it was not possible to sexually sexually molest and rape a black woman, because his view was that black people have an animalistic inability to control themselves, right? To control themselves. And that the black woman has such sexual appetite that it is in fact actually impossible to commit rape against her. And here I quote, right? He asserts that it's the nature of every African woman to want sex at any opportunity. Quote, adultery seems to be their most favorite pastime. And then he continues, I have very serious doubt as to whether the crime of rape can be committed upon a Negro, end quote. This is page 305, right? Let's consider another character. And this time we're looking at, again, a senator now from South Carolina by the name of Ben Tillman. Ben Tillman's comments that I'm going to quote to you are in the context of a lynching that had actually taken place in the North, not in the South, in the North, right? And this is a lynching of a black school teacher by the name of David Wyatt. He was the 13th African American to be lynched in 1903. And a newspaper called The Advertiser wrote a long editorial, which was a gleeful, celebratory editorial upon this lynching, because the lynching had taken place in the North, and white elites and racists in the South said, that shows that even in the North, there are sensible white people who recognize that the black man cannot be really viewed as fully human, really, right? This is not, so don't just put the blame on us in the Deep South. It's not just us who are responsible for these things. You know, if you're going to accuse us of being depraved, well, you're depraved too. But of course, that was not the view in the South, that this was a form, lynching was not a form of depravity. It was something that once in a while had to be done to show the black man his place, right? And so the author here, Blackmon, cites this editorial at considerable length, right? And then the comments of this senator from South Carolina, and this is what he said, quote, I see you're learning how to kill and burn niggers. That's right. Let the good work go on. Keep it up. You're getting some sense. End quote. Page 200. Right? And now a third character. There are many such characters. And it needs to be said that this book is very much on these people too, on these white supremacists, right? Because for one thing, they wrote profusely, they were prolific. There are dozens of newspapers in the South that embraced the view of the white slave-owning elite. Newspapers such as the Prattville Progress. I'm here looking at small newspapers in some cases much bigger. The Birmingham Ledger, the Montgomery Advertiser, that's the newspaper I just adverted to a minute ago, the Birmingham Age Herald, Atlanta Constitution, the Chattanooga Times, the Columbus Inquirer-Sun, the Shelby County Sentinel, and many others, right? So the black people who were actually put back into slavery, we don't really know much about many of them, because who was going to record their lives, right? So you have a black man who's taken back into slavery. We still haven't seen how that happened, and that's the next thing I'm going to get to, right? But a man, let's say, works in a mines for 10 years, hardly ever sees any sunlight, and just dies in the mines. And then his body is taken out and just thrown into a ditch or thrown into a field and quickly buried, right? We don't really know much about these. So it's not as though the author is wanting to emphasize the biographical accounts of the slave owners. It's that we don't know very much really about many of the hundreds of thousands of black people upon whom these atrocities are going to be inflicted, right? But I think we get a better sense of the viewpoint of the Deep South, of the white elites in the Deep South, when he looks at some of these characters that I'm really talking about. So now we have this U.S. Senator from Alabama by the name of James Thomas Heflin. This is, he discusses his views on page 122, a person who was an ardent believer in slavery. And this is what he had to say. I believe, quote, as truly as I believe that I'm standing here, that God Almighty intended the Negro to be the servant of the white man, end quote. And he says we have to anticipate a race war. Quote, I do not believe it is incumbent upon us to lift him, the Negro, up and educate him on an equal footing that he may be armed and equipped when the combat comes, right? He doesn't say if the combat comes. He says when the combat comes. At some point there is going to be a race war between us and the black people, and therefore it would be foolish of us to educate these people, right? Lift them up, make them more advanced, because obviously we're strengthening the enemy. And he was also firmly of the view that the only way that you could keep black people under control was through a regime of draconian punishment, including the whip. The book is full of accounts of people who were going to be whipped, mercilessly whipped. And he says, quote, everybody knows that the great bulk of convicts in the state are Negroes. Everybody knows the character of a Negro and knows that there is no punishment in the world that can take the place of the lash with him. He must be controlled that way, end quote. Right? So how were these people taken back into slavery? The first thing we have to remember, of course, is that at the end of slavery, officially, as it were, at the end of the Civil War, black people obviously had to find a mode of living. And very often they had to go back to their slave owners, to the person to whom the white person to whom the black man or black woman had been previously enslaved. Except that they went back, obviously, as free laborers officially, and they put a price on their labor. They put a price on their labor. This is the first thing, of course, that enraged the former white slave owners, that these black people now had the gumption to come to them and say, hey, I'm going to farm your land, but I'm farming it as a free person, and this is what I'm going to ask. This is my price. This is the price I set for my labor. Now, what I have told you before explains, and that's why that was necessary first, right? Explains the worldview of these white slave owners and racists. Right? So they were, in fact, and he is very clear about this, that these people were determined to impose, white people were determined to impose a regime of terror on the black person. And it will take a few years after the end of the Civil War, when the troops finally are going to start withdrawing, and the initial phase of Reconstruction, as it is called, is going to be over. Right? So page 42, this is where Blackmon makes the claim, which is essential to understand why these people, the black people, were now going to be taken back into slavery through hook or crook. Right? In the first decades of that span, the intensity of Southern whites' need to re-establish hegemony over blacks rivaled the most visceral patriotism of the wartime Confederacy. White Southerners initiated, right, so the first decades of that span is the first decades after the end of the Civil War. White Southerners initiated an extraordinary campaign of defiance and subversion against the new biracial social order imposed on the South, and mandated by the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which abolished slavery. They organized themselves into vigilante groups, gangs and militias, undermined free elections across the region, intimidated Union agents, terrorized black leaders, and waged an extremely effective propaganda campaign to place blame for the anarchic behavior of whites upon freed slaves, right? And waged an extremely effective propaganda campaign to place blame for the anarchic behavior of whites upon freed slaves. So, end quote. So, once we understand this worldview, their determination to impose what I'm calling very simply a regime of terror, we can understand that they had to come up with all kinds of different kinds of contrivances, including legal, in order to put the black man back and the black woman back in their place as the whites saw it. So, for example, you had a whole set of laws having to do with vagabonds. So let's say you have a black person who has gone to look for work, right? He's gone to look for work. Many of these black people, by the way, were people who had absolutely no money or very little money. So he boards a freight train without having purchased a ticket, right? Which, of course, many other people did too, including white people. He gets down at a depot and is walking somewhere in the hope of being able to find some work, whereupon he is stopped by a white person. Right? He's stopped by a white person. And so here I now give the story of a man called John Davis, a story that commences on page 123 and continues until page 134. Right? So this is the story of this man who in Georgia, in a place on the outskirts of a town called Goodwater. This is what happens to him in September 1901, right? So he gets off this train and is walking to a place, and he is confronted by a white man who suddenly shouts at him and says, page 124, quote, "Nigger, have you got any money?" The man who was asking this question was Robert and Franklin, one of the town's appointed constables. That is, a person charged with imposing law and order. Right? And one of the things that Blackmon is going to show is that these people, these are not trained policemen, of course, they're just someone who has been appointed from within the town. And also, he talks about justices of the peace. Again, justice of the peace sounds like a very lofty term. What it was basically was the town's white men, right? Who, some of whom would be appointed justices of the peace, and this meant that they actually had certain powers, which were legal powers, including custodial powers, right? So a person charged with a crime would be brought to the justice of the peace, who would conduct some kind of superficial hearing, right? And then sentence the person. And so what happens to John Davis is he's asked this question, and Davis, so I'm not going to describe in great detail the interaction, but Davis would have understood immediately the gravity of this question, right? And Blackmon says, with a single hostile query, "Nigger, have you got any money?" Franklin distilled the smothering layers of legal and economic jeopardy that defined black life in the 20th century South. Davis was pent. "No, I have not got any money," the black man stammered. And then he says, "Well, I have some, but not for you. When are you going to pay me the money you owe me?" Franklin presses. Davis says, "I don't owe you any money." He's never even seen him before. He's never seen this white man. Now, this white man has come up with an allegation. So what is he going to do? He's then going to bring a kind of like a posse, three other white men, because Franklin then slips away. Davis slips away. Franklin goes back and brings a number of other white men. They corner this guy. And then Franklin produces two witnesses who are going to say that, yes, Davis owes this man money. And not only that, he's actually broken the law. He's a vagabond, because they had these laws, okay, where you could be arrested for loitering on the street, right? That's what a vagabond is. And so this man is now going to be taken to the justice of the peace, who's going to say, "Well, do you have any witnesses on your behalf?" The black man has no witnesses on his behalf at all. He's sometimes 10 miles away from his home. Sometimes he's 200 miles away from his home, to the extent that he has a home, right? The witnesses on behalf of the white man, Franklin, are going to say that, yes, this black man owes him money. We remember a transaction that occurred at such and such time. They're going to concoct this whole evidence. The justice of the peace convicts, and the sheriff will then haul him away, because he's going to say, "Well, you now owe this white man $60. Do you have the sum of money?" Davis says, "Of course I don't have $60. He says, "Well, if you don't have this sum of money, then you're going to have to serve a sentence in jail for 1 year. He goes to jail, but this jail and the sheriff who runs this jail have contracted to lease this man out to a corporation. So the corporation says, "We pick up your fine. We'll pay the fine, but in return, you have to labor for us for 1 year under conditions that we describe." A large part of this book is given to describing how this happened in one case after another. And the conditions under which these people were compelled, black people were compelled to labor, are absolutely horrific. Blackmon is very clear, crystal clear, that in fact these working conditions were much worse in many ways than anything that was encountered under slavery itself. Right? So page 218, he says, and here, by the way, he's citing the report of an inspector appointed by the U.S. government, right? Because, word was passing out that slavery has actually been restored back in the South in various ways. So the U.S. government is going to attempt to investigate this matter. A considerable portion of the book is also devoted to discussing that and showing why this led to no real consequences for these white people. There were a few convictions, incidentally. In most of these cases, these convictions amounted to, a month or two in jail, maybe $500 in fines, and then these people went back to doing exactly what they were doing. Right? So, but this is what one report on this system of indentured servitude said. Quote, "It is by no means confined to a few isolated communities. I have also been again and again informed by these persons that this peonage system is more cruel and inhuman than the slavery of antebellum days, slavery before the war, right? Since then, the master conserved the life and health of the slave for business reasons, just as he did that of his horse or mule. But now the master treated the slave unmercifully, and with the sole object of getting the greatest possible amount of labor out of him. Moreover, a peon cost but a few dollars, while a slave used to cost several hundred. End quote, page 218. Right? And there are witnesses who will describe the gruesome conditions under which these people worked. Sometimes men were whipped daily. Their flesh would just come off. They were worked to death, and literally the bodies were just thrown into ditches. Once these people had given their labor, there was no life left in them, and they were just simply left to die. Right? It was just plain murder, frankly, that was being committed upon a large number of black people in this period. And there are witnesses who will constantly testify to the condition of these mines, right? So here we have one person, because of course there were some people who were deeply disturbed and offended. And that's where we get some of these witnesses too, even before the United States government appointed attorneys to look into these matters, right? So, for example, one person gave this testimony. This is on page 177. This is at what is called the Cottingham Plantation. When I found this boy, he was at the sawmill at work, completely naked, no clothes on at all, absolutely naked. And there were some 6 or 8 other Negroes there working in the same naked condition. Right? U.S. Attorney Reese, who was one of these people who was appointed to look into this, this is what he had to say in his report that he filed from Montgomery. The conditions of the black belt in this district are more deplorable as the investigations of this grand jury proceed. It is now being revealed that hundreds of Negroes are held in peonage and involuntary servitude of the most vicious character. Men and women are arrested on the flimsiest charges. They are brutally whipped, worked, and locked up without let or hindrance. The tortures inflicted are severe and sometimes result in total disability or death. Some counties in this district are honeycombed with these slave trade practices. It was extremely widespread. And many of the major southern cities were built on the back of this slave labor. Now, I will not belabor these points. I'll only get to the last point that I really want to make here, and that is that it really only came to an end with World War II. This trafficking in human labor, because when Nazi atrocities came to the fore, and remember the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Allied forces were fighting this war to save the world from the menace of totalitarianism. And totalitarianism included slave labor, right? To make the world safe for democracy, it was a travesty that the U.S. should be claiming to fight this war this way when millions of people in the United States itself were being held in conditions of slavery, right? This is really why the whole thing ended. And on pages 379-80, Blackmon has a brief discussion of this matter. I think that this is a discussion that could have been profitably much lengthier than it is, right? And so here we have he gives a quotation from the U.S. attorney in Mobile. Mobile is in Alabama, right? Francis Ing, and he writes a note to Assistant Attorney General Wendell Burge, where he describes, some of the complexities of this matter, why the United States needs to do something. And here I have a quotation now from this Attorney General, Wendell Burge, Quote, the matter complained of in this instant case is but one of many in which members of the Negro race have been the victims. He's responding to a complaint that has arrived in the Attorney General's office about this form of slavery still persisting in the U.S. Enemy propagandists have used similar episodes in international broadcasts to the colored race, saying that the democracies are insincere and that the enemy is their friend. Right? Now we understand why the United States finally felt compelled to act. Right? Anyhow, this book is a book that covers a period that shockingly, surprisingly, very few people know anything about. And I think in this sense, Blackmon has done us his subject justice. He has performed a valuable service with a finely written book. I think the detail sometimes is a little excessive. The book runs into 470 pages, including notes, small print. But, that's not a problem intrinsic to the book as such. It's some amount of editing may have been useful. What is really most instructive is that this book shows us why slavery and involuntary servitude persisted in the United States, and the conditions under which it persisted, and in the manner in which it persisted for decades. Though the impression that most people got was that the problem had been resolved after the constitutional amendments. Thank you.